many departments still take a position where they sometimes, without meaning to, will actually have a higher level of response or punishment towards the victim officer for coming forward. Why didn't you report this immediately? So the officer who's the victim is actually receiving more days off than the abuser.
It goes without saying that domestic violence is a terrible problem in any situation, but it's even worse when the abuser is a police officer. Studies show that domestic violence is 2 to 4 times more likely to occur in households of law enforcement officers. Today, Catherine MacWillie is back. She's a former LAPD officer who founded Custody Calculations, a business devoted to helping with family law issues. Pleasure to have you again back once again today, Catherine. So, you know, I'm not anti-police. I want to say that at the start. I think when something goes wrong, what's the first thing you do is you call the police. But in this case, when the police are the problem, how does that affect things? I mean,
well, you know, what we're talking about is domestic violence within law enforcement itself. You have people, both a husband and wife, who might be employed by the same police agency or different police agencies, and one's the victim and one's the abuser. Or you could have relationships where one of the parties is a law enforcement officer and the other isn't. And I think what you're saying is, who do you call or who do you depend on? Because the first thing
you'd say, if you heard that somebody was getting beat up, you say, well, why don't you call the police?
Right.
Well, you call the police, and it could be the guy showing up at your door, I suppose.
Or their other partner.
Yeah,
their other partner showing up. It certainly makes it much more difficult to how do we deal with these issues. I mean, law enforcement, just like society, has really found this issue, you know, somewhat difficult to deal with. I mean, 24 years ago, when I was a young officer in the department, I still remember one of the first calls that I went to in which the woman hid in a closet, and she was the victim of domestic violence. And we're saying, we're the police, we're here to help you, come out. And we actually had to search the house for her because even though there was 6 police officers in the house, she was so afraid of her abuser that she wouldn't come out. And then to make matters worse, when she was in the closet and she was badly bruised, we could see that. She said, I'm not a victim. There's no problem here. And we could see that she was beaten. Well, officers, when they're victims of domestic violence, go through the same scenario. They have difficulty accepting that something like this could happen to them when they're powerful and they're expected to solve other people's problems.
I mean, hiding in the closet when you're the police officer and you've got the gun, I mean, that must be... Well, and let's just kind of spell this out here, I mean, for a few things. First of all, again, I mean, they've got a gun when you're talking to the police, you know, that's a problem. As some of these studies show, I mean, they know how to manipulate the system. You know, they know where the battered women's shelters are, and, you know, what to say and not to say, and all of that. I mean, all of that comes into play, let alone when you say that it's a police officer, it could be your friends. I mean, just think of, let's say, the embarrassment issue. You know, it'd be like your you know, if you don't want your coworkers or colleagues or friends to know, well, in this case, that's who you're calling into your house for help. You know, it's such a personal situation, and...
You're right. You know, who do you call if you're the officer and you're the victim, or if you're the abuser? You know, and both of you know the outcome, which is internal affairs, investigations, the inability to promote. If someone's pending a promotion, that promotion will be held up.
It is held up.
It is held up. You know, police departments do try to make, and are making inroads into this. They're trying to make sure that they don't promote someone who is an abuser. I've actually, during my career, worked with officers, one in particular right now that's serving a prison sentence. Prison sentence for domestic violence. There was more than one incident, there was more than 2 incidences, and finally after 4 incidents, the escalation of that officer was such that they filed charges and he was convicted, and rightly so.
Now, when you say 4 incidents, what exactly, do you mean, was it the same woman or same?
There was 2 different relationships involved, and I believe there was 2 incidences on each of those relationships, but...
And how serious are we talking? I mean, there have been stories in the news lately about, you know, we said beforehand, I mean, look, police officers are human like everybody else, but there have been the high-profile national cases of police officers who, you know, murdered their wives. Or one case, I think the deputy in Florida, sheriff's deputy, whatever, went into a party and killed like 6 people, including his girlfriend or somebody you liked or whatever. So, I mean, how, was it murder or how bad was it? Just, I want to say just beating him up.
Well, a prison sentence is a felony,
Okay.
and what we're talking about is there was severe injuries. We should point out that what we're talking about is, I usually divide this into 4 categories. There's false allegations of domestic violence. Remember, as you said, that the families, police families, are representative of the communities that they live in, that they support. We didn't land from a different planet and suddenly become police officers. We're reflective of how we grew up in our communities, how we serve our communities. So we have just the same issues where people take advantage of department complaint systems for different advantages to...
And I suppose also if you are a police officer, then you know the way the system works. So if you do want to file a false accusation, you have some sense of how that will affect the person. And
exactly. And that's part of how my company started investigating some of these issues, was that we realized that some people were using the department's complaint system to file false allegations of domestic abuse in order to gain an advantage in a family law court system. But then you have mild cases, then you have moderate cases, and then what I call the severe cases. Most departments typically don't struggle much with severe cases. Those are broken bones, facial broken bones, black eyes, broken arms, broken ribs. Those are usually much more clear, and police departments are usually very aggressive in seeking prosecution on those cases.
because there's been some question about that. I mean, some of the studies said, I think there was one from LAPD that said, they did a study of 91 cases where it was sustained that very few of the people's careers were really affected. In a lot of cases, it didn't show up in their performance evaluations, it didn't affect their promotions. But you're saying that's not your experience. You think that,
Well,
or
no.
these days, that they really do.
The report that you're talking about was done by the Attorney General, the Attorney General for the City of Los Angeles Police Department, Catherine Mader. And what they did is they analyzed how well does the department respond to its own internal investigations. And they evaluated cases between, I believe it was 1991 through, or 1990 through 1997. So, you know, a 5 to 7 year history. And they actually did a review of like 227 cases, and they broke it down to did it have any relationship to the amount of years that the officers had on the department, broke it down, and they did find that, you know, in those particular, I think it was in 91 or 92 cases, the severity of the situation was such that the officers should have faced pretty substantial consequences for their actions, and probably even criminal prosecutions. And that was not the case.
Not the case.
Not the case. The rating reports, there was no mention of it. They were, in many cases, still promoted. The promotions might have been held up or slowed up, but most of them still promoted.
Is that the way it still works today, or?
No, I think the department has made substantial, you know, forward progression towards solving that issue. But are there still problems? Absolutely. It's still.
Another thing which surprised me, maybe it's understandable, but they say that the incidence of domestic violence is higher among law enforcement officers, that it's something, you know, as I said at the beginning, I've seen different figures. One case said it was 40% of law enforcement households, another said it was, but at least higher than the national average. Do you think that's true, and if so, why?
You know, it probably is true, and there's probably several factors related to that. First of all, the bar for violence is much higher in law enforcement families. The stress levels that we
You're
deal
dealing with
with
it every day on the job.
Right. What is normal for most people in dealing with crime and devastation and violence is much lower. So the level which officers respond to violence is much higher also, and then a majority of officers do bring their weapons home. I did not choose to do that a majority of the time. I had young children in the home, but a majority of officers do bring their weapons home. And so and if you have 2 officers, both male and female, that have guns, that's a lot of guns in a household.
Sure.
And, you know, if you're fearful, one of the first things you're going to do is go for your gun, because that's what your training leads you to believe. And if you're the abuser, the first action you go towards is your gun, or, again, a higher level of violence.
Now, I'm assuming, again, we're mostly talking men doing this to women, or do the women do it to the guys, or whatever the situation may be these days?
Certainly, you know, again, police departments are reflective of society, and typically it is men who are more aggressive towards women, but there are cases where women have abused men, both on the department and outside the department.
And, I mean, has it turned deadly? I mean, at least with LAPD, where, I mean, if they both have guns, I mean, even Do they ever have shootouts at home? I mean, people get killed. I mean, have you heard of? Are you familiar with cases
Well,
like that here in
and there's
town,
one instance in particular that I'm thinking of right now, Ramos, case of Ramos versus the city of Los Angeles, and I believe this was prior to 1997. They actually had an officer that was involved in a situation in which his gun was removed. I believe two different cases. Ramos, the city of Los Angeles, paid out over $2 million in a case involving an officer who shot and killed his girlfriend and her relationship. And they found the department negligent in returning the handgun that ultimately resulted in their deaths. The officer also committed suicide in that particular shooting.
We'll be right back. And we are back with Catherine MacWillie today talking about domestic violence among law enforcement officers. Well, there's a sense sometimes with complaints against the police department in general. I've read these studies, that things tend to get swept under the rug. A professor at the University of Chicago did a study of the Chicago Police Department, and I think something like of 1,000 I'm sorry, I don't have the exact figures, but of thousands of complaints, like very few were actually sustained by the police department and acted upon. Now that was just in general, not domestic violence. But I guess what I'm getting at is that we were talking about the blue wall during the break. I mean, are the police covering for each other? I mean, as internal affairs, are they really there to get the guy or the woman, or are they trying to sweep it under the rug and not get sued and not get the bad PR and?
Well, I think it's a very valid statement. There's certainly been enough Hollywood movies out there written about, how officers, protect other officers. And certainly when you're in a car for 8 hours, 10 hours, or 12 hours, you develop a very close relationship with your partner. But I can tell you also that, as an officer, I am not about to protect a partner, no matter how close my relationship is, from any allegation of, domestic abuse. That, again, we have different levels of domestic abuse, and in some cases, I think the department's gone too far, where they're investigating. Well, in situations where a couple may be yelling or screaming at each other, and someone calls the police, and the police arrive, and all that's happened is they've had a loud argument. That's, one issue in which the officers can look at taking days off because they've been mad or angry with each other and they yelled at each other. And someone can become overly aggressive in internal affairs and the officer can end up taking days. Then there's the other scenario in which someone is sitting there bruised or injured, their arms have been twisted, they've been thrown to the ground, and I don't think there's an officer out there that really, if they know the facts, that would protect a partner in that type of scenario. I mean, we have a responsibility to protect the public. But the other side of the coin is when you're the victim officer, what we do know is that the departments still, and many departments, still take a position where they sometimes, without meaning to, will actually have a higher level of response or punishment towards the victim officer for coming forward. Why didn't you report this immediately? So the officer who's the victim is actually receiving more days off than the abuser in an incident.
So in effect, I mean, well, do you think that police officers, woman or male, I suppose, in another case, but are they less likely to call the police? Because again, that number one, you're going to be airing your personal business with the whole department. It's going to cause a big mess at work. I mean, so you think our people are less likely to call because of all of that? Or? Well,
I think it is true. I think that officers are less likely to want to call the police because it will result in the department investigating the situation. They want to also give the benefit of the doubt to the partner, and when I say partner, I mean the person that they're involved with, higher stress levels, or they also have a higher level of disbelief. The reality that this is happening to them also plays into their not wanting to necessarily call for the police or for a response. And then also the other issue is it is embarrassment, I think, for most of these officers that I've spoken to. They have, how could this happen to me? How could I not control this? Plays huge factors.
Well, we were talking about the police response in general, or maybe LAPD, since you're more familiar with that situation. You had told me about the case of Bob Mullally, who you want to tell us about what happened with him?
Bob Mullally was a legal consultant that was retained by an attorney, and he received confidential files dealing with police officers on the Los Angeles Police Department related to the lawsuit that this attorney had filed. And Bob Mullally was so outraged by the case files that he read, again, we're going back to prior to 1997, that in violation of a gag order, he stepped forward and said, I will violate the law. This is wrong. That these officers, when they do come forward, are being victimized more by the police agency they work for than the abuser. And this is wrong. And so, I personally, think that he deserves a lot of credit, because ultimately Bob Malawi served a sentence of 45 days for a violation of that gag order. He's one of the few people in the country.
He leaked the material to the press,
He leaked the material, the press, the files, and everything, documenting that this was not his personal opinion, but these were the facts behind the cases that were being inappropriately adjudicated by the Los Angeles Police Department. And his bold step forward actually caused a lot of good action to be taken, and for police departments around the United States to more effectively look at how they were dealing with that issue.
Let's say, interestingly enough, that despite the fact that he spent time in jail, that apparently none of the officers that he pointed out in the report actually spent time in jail for what they were doing at home.
Right, and that's why, I applaud you also, because this is a tough issue, and we do need to raise consciousness, because as much as the step forwards that Bob Malawi allowed us to take forward, and as many organizations involved in this issue are still trying to take step forwards, the progress is not fast enough. There's still too many agencies out there that don't have a good, strong policy. We know that abusers take baby steps. We're condoning those baby steps. We're actually supporting and allowing these abusers to escalate their behavior by not curtailing them at the earlier stages.
Right at the start. Well, when you talk about some of the changes, I understand that there's a federal law now that deals with something like domestic violence, gun ban, and part of it applies to police and military, restricting their carrying equipment, as you called the gun beforehand. Is that working? What's your experience from the LAPD side?
Well, I've actually sat in some of the courtrooms. I've been involved in some of the cases, filed paperwork, been familiar and worked with officers who had what we call the equipment restrictions. Those are officers who've had their handguns removed. One of the spouses or the relationships would make an allegation that there was domestic violence involved. So the restraining order would be issued. Now, I can tell you that the judges hear these cases very carefully. They try to make good decisions. They're trying to determine, without any hearing of any evidence, because that's part of the issue here too. There's no hearing as to the evidence as to the validity of the claim when they have an emergency protection order issued, which is a little bit different than, there's several steps involved. An emergency protection order is issued over the phone. 24 hours a day, a judge can be contacted for an emergency protection order.
So somebody calls and says, I'm in danger, somebody's trying to
a law enforcement officer responds, and they'll hear the case, then they will contact a judge, and the judge will make the final determination. But when you have officers, law enforcement officers responding, the judge is very careful because of the steps involved. They don't want to be premature because it's so affecting to the officer's career. On the other hand, they want to err on the side of caution. So they do take these steps. I think some of them are very, these are good steps to take. We should err on the side of caution, and we have to get more accustomed to that within law enforcement, that we may look and have officers' guns taken or steps taken during an initial investigation. Doesn't mean it's easy on the officers or their careers, but as the awareness increases, hopefully it will make fewer mistakes.
So they actually do take the guns away in some cases?
Yes, and they do take it precautionary. They do take it on the restraining orders. They do take these guns. And then as the evidence or the investigation continues, if the officer is cleared of the allegations, then the guns and equipment restrictions are lifted. If they're not, the officers are greater number of officers facing criminal charges, but again, still not to the level of having allegations filed against people who file false allegations against their officers. That's, the two-edged sword. The person who files the false complaint has no allegations or criminal actions for them taken, and the officer is impacted. So,
I guess if they do take away your gun, you're pretty much sidelined or whatever, like a desk job or something? Or
well, more and more agencies are looking at the fact that if a handgun is taken, the officer is no longer capable of doing their job because of equipment restrictions or other physical restrictions. This is, an area that's new for police departments, then maybe they need to look at firing the officers.
We'll be right back. And we are back with Catherine MacWillie, a former LAPD officer, today talking about domestic violence among law enforcement officers. Well, I understand the Chicago Police Department is kind of leading the forefront in this a bit. What are they up to?
Well, what they've done is they have oversight by civilians on their issues dealing with domestic violence. A lot of agencies are looking at that as an option. Los Angeles Police Department for years has had that option, and up until now they've not necessarily wanted to support that.
Most police officers, forces don't like civilian reviews, right?
Well, yeah, because they don't necessarily bring with it an education that's appropriate to some of the situations that we deal with.
What you're really dealing with on the streets.
But on the other hand, I think that they also bring another level of expertise that maybe we do need some oversight. So I'm still not sure what my, position is on that, and I'm not sure what the research shows. That's the other thing. But we need to qualify some of our decisions process based on what good, solid research is showing. I like some of the work that's being done by the International Association of Chief of Police. This is an association that's very much on the forefront of trying to do what's right in not only for the police agencies, for the public they serve, and this is one of the issues.
What are some of the things they're looking at doing?
Well, instead of having each department think of and do research on how to deal with this issue, they're trying to make the rules more easily understood. They're trying to make it so it's not so difficult for agencies to put in place a good, solid policy, a good solid procedure to deal with these issues. Is there recognition of the baby steps, the steps taken towards the first steps of domestic violence? Why are we waiting until someone's shot or murdered or broken bones?
Right.
We can curtail some of that with better policies instituted at the initial steps.
I'm just curious. We had talked beforehand about a group, I think the Van Ness organization or something that works with the Sheriff's Department as well.
Yes, the Ness Counseling Center.
Okay, yes.
Ness Counseling Center. Dennis Brown is the director for the Ness Counseling Center, and in fact, originally we had wanted him to join us, and there was a scheduling conflict for today and on some prior dates. But Ness Counseling Center actually has or previously had in place a counseling program specific to law enforcement for the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department. So officers that were identified or felt that they were at risk could be sent to the Ness Counseling Center located in the city of Los Angeles, in which they would work and participate in groups, and that they would given avenues by which they could deal with this issue more effectively. And the police departments were also given this as an effective manner specific to the issue of law enforcement.
One reason I mentioned that, I was just curious, since obviously this is something, it's not just LAPD, it happens to other law enforcement agencies as well. But because, at least in portions, their area of their jurisdiction overlaps with the Sheriff's Department and the Police Department. Are you familiar with any cases where, like, an LAPD officer maybe called the sheriff on the husband, or the sheriff called the police on the husband or wife, or something like that?
Well, there's a lot of cases out there like that. There's just like, if you work in a hospital, and you're a nurse, you probably marry a doctor, or if you work in, whatever industry you work and you're associated, most of your free time is spent with those people. Well, law enforcement is no different. In fact, we're probably a closer knit family, and you have a tendency to marry someone within law enforcement because of the recognition of the difficult hours, the stress of the job, and so on. So we have a lot of officers that marry that are on two different departments. I know quite a few officers. Some are on Los Angeles Police Department, some are on Long Beach Police Department, some are on the LA County Sheriff's Department.
Does that make it better or worse in these kind of situations? Are they more likely to intervene or less likely if it's a different agency?
Well, what that means actually is when officers respond, you have you could have three police agencies involved. The responding police agency, if they're outside the jurisdiction, live outside the jurisdiction of the Los Angeles Police Department, let's say in this scenario, one's an LAPD officer, one's an LA County Sheriff's Department member, and then you have a responding agency, let's say it's Long Beach Police Department. So now you have three agencies investigating that one incident. So it gets, the stress levels get pretty high. So you've got the officers responding, then you go through an internal affairs investigation with both of the police agencies and interviews with all of those. You're tape recorded, you're given your rights, you're told if you don't answer questions you can be fired. So a lot of, stress involved in these cases.
Yeah, and I guess I was thinking too of a situation where maybe if the spouse was married to a police officer, but they weren't both. And like if he was LAPD and she calls the sheriff on him, I just wondered if, that
Happens all the time.
Because I've heard sometimes there's a little
Right.
rivalry among the agencies, and I just wonder how that would play out. But
Well, if it's an officer within your own department, you probably are taking additional steps to protect that officer. Like if LAPD responds, they may be taking additional steps. The Sheriff's Department responds. But again, what we're trying to do with that policy by the International Police Chiefs Organization is we're trying to make sure we have the most appropriate response, regardless of what agency, that the favoritism is a better investigation and not a sweeping of it under the rug.
so how soon do you think we might see some of these changes being instituted? Or because I've read some of the things that say, like they look good in the police manual, but are they actually? I mean, you think this is something that will actually have a real?
Well, I think shows like this are definitely a first step. We need to keep this out there. We need to keep discussing it. I know that because I do radio shows also to this issue. Just recently, a case involving a police officer, one of the callers who called in said, "Don't you just protect that person because you're law enforcement." I am not going to sit next to anybody and protect them from allegations of domestic violence or any other crime.
Well, thank you very much for being here again today.
Thank you
Catherine
again.
MacWillie, former LAPD officer, founder of Custody Calculations. Thanks everybody for watching. We'll see you next time. But obviously it doesn't always get to that level. It's just more, like you said, the shouting matches.
Yeah, we're running the gamut now. We're in shouting matches. It's ridiculous. We take people to jail, even outside police officer families. Ridiculous some of the arrests that we're making.